In my will, I discovered that the granddaughter to whom I entrusted everything had called me a materialistic grandmother. But there was one detail in the will that changed everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end. And comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The manila folder lay open on Richard's mahogany desk. Its contents spread before me like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. My lawyer of 20 years shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, clearing his throat for what must have been the fourth time. Rosana, I truly apologize. I would never have shown you this draft if I'd known what was written there. Richard's voice was gentle, the way people speak to the terminally ill. I stared at the paper, my vision blurring around the edges as I read the words again, hoping they might somehow rearrange themselves into something less painful. While I acknowledge the financial support of my grandmother, Rosana Miller, I must express my concern about the materialistic values that have defined her life and relationships. The words burned into my consciousness, each one a tiny dagger. Ruth, my Ruth, had written this. My favorite grandchild. The one I'd put through college, helped buy her first home, funded her struggling art gallery when everyone else said it would fail. There must be some mistake, I whispered, my voice sounding foreign even to my own ears. Ruth wouldn't say this. Richard removed his glasses, polishing them with his pocket square, a nervous habit I'd noticed over our many years of friendship. The document came directly from her, Rosana. It's part of her statement for the family trust documentation. At 75, I'd weathered many storms. My husband's early death, raising 3 children alone, building a business from nothing. But this betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. I remembered Ruth at 5, her small hand in mine as we walked through the botanical gardens. At 12, sobbing on my shoulder when her parents divorced. At 22, throwing her graduation cap in the air while I cheered from the audience, my heart nearly bursting with pride. "Would you like some water?" Richard asked, already reaching for the crystal carafe on his desk. I shook my head, gathering the papers with trembling hands. I'd like to go home now. The drive back to my house was a blur. Autumn leaves swirled across the windshield, their vibrant colors at odds with the grayness that had settled over my world. I pulled into my driveway, the sprawling Victorian I'd purchased after selling my company, the home where Ruth had spent countless weekends and summer vacations. Inside, I moved through familiar rooms that suddenly felt like a museum, filled with expensive things that apparently defined me in my granddaughter's eyes. The antique writing desk where I'd helped Ruth with her college applications. The kitchen where we'd baked Christmas cookies every December. Had it all meant nothing to her? I sank into my armchair by the window, watching as the afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawn. My phone buzzed, a text from Ruth herself. "Just checking in, Gran. Dinner on Sunday still good? Love you." The casual affection in her message made the wound even deeper. How could she write such loving texts while describing me as materialistic to my lawyer? Beside me on the side table was a framed photo, Ruth and me at her gallery opening last year. We were laughing, champagne glasses raised in celebration. I'd written a check for $50,000 that night to help her expand to a second location. Was that all I was to her? A checkbook with a pulse? I thought of all the financial support I'd given her over the years. The tuition payments, the down payment on her house, the gallery funding. I'd never hesitated, not once, because I loved her, because I wanted her life to be easier than mine had been. But perhaps I'd been foolish. Perhaps in trying to show my love through financial security, I'd somehow convinced her that money was all I cared about. My fingers hovered over the phone. I could confront her now, demand an explanation. But something held me back. If I wanted the truth, the real truth, I needed to understand what had brought us to this point. I picked up the phone and typed a reply that betrayed none of my heartbreak. "Looking forward to it, sweetheart. 6 p.m. as usual." Then I put down my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of my being. When the tears finally subsided, a strange clarity emerged from the pain. Before Sunday's dinner, I needed answers. And I would find them, even if they shattered what remained of my heart. The next morning, I awoke with a sense of purpose that cut through my grief. If Ruth truly believed I was materialistic, I needed to understand why. This wasn't just about hurt feelings. This was about unraveling a misunderstanding that had apparently been growing for years. I didn't have many days before Sunday dinner, and I needed answers. My first call was to my son, James, Ruth's father. We'd always been close, especially after his divorce from Diane 12 years ago. "Mom, this is a surprise," he said, the sounds of his accounting office humming in the background. "Everything okay?" "Just checking in." I kept my voice light. "How's Ruth doing these days? We haven't had a real talk in a while." There was a slight pause. "She's managing?" "The gallery's doing well, but I think there's some strain with Eric." Eric Sanders, Ruth's husband of 3 years. A charming architecture professor I'd never quite warmed to, despite my best efforts. "Financial troubles?" I asked, trying to sound casual. James sighed. "She wouldn't tell me directly, but I helped her with the gallery's quarterly taxes last month. There were some discrepancies, large withdrawals that weren't related to the business." My heart quickened. "Did she explain them?" "Said they were personal investments." Changed the subject pretty quickly. After hanging up with James, I sat at my computer, a cup of tea growing cold beside me. I wasn't technically savvy, but I knew enough to access the online banking portal for the joint account I'd established for Ruth's gallery, the one I still contributed to monthly. The transaction history told a story Ruth apparently didn't want me to know. Regular transfers to their joint household account, far larger than what the gallery should have needed for operating expenses. And then something else. Payments to a company called Sanders Architectural Heritage, Eric's side business. One he'd mentioned starting, but had told me was self-funded. I leaned back in my chair, pieces starting to fall into place. But I needed more information. At noon, I did something I'd never done before. I drove to Ruth's gallery unannounced. The urban canvas was quiet on a Thursday afternoon, just one attendant at the front desk who recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Miller." "Ruth, didn't mention you were coming by today." "Just in the neighborhood, Zoe. Is she in?" "She left for lunch with her husband about 20 minutes ago. They usually go to Marigold Cafe around the corner." I thanked her and left quickly. Marigold Cafe was only 2 blocks away, with a large window facing the street. I found a bench. Across from it, my heart pounding with the absurdity of what I was doing. 75 years old, and essentially spying on my granddaughter. Through the window, I could see them clearly, Ruth and Eric at a corner table, heads close together, in what appeared to be an intense conversation. Ruth looked stressed, running her hands through her auburn hair the way she always did when upset. Eric was speaking animatedly, his hands gesturing sharply. At one point, Ruth covered her face with her hands. When she lowered them, I could see tears on her cheeks. My instinct was to rush in there, to demand what was wrong, to fix it the way I always had. Instead, I remained seated, feeling like an intruder in their private struggle. When they finally emerged from the cafe, I ducked behind a newspaper stand. They walked past me, Eric's arm around Ruth's shoulders in what could have been comfort, but somehow looked possessive to my critical eye. That evening, I called my oldest friend Margaret. If anyone would give me an honest assessment, it would be her. "Of course I can meet for coffee tomorrow," she said. "Is everything all right?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "I need some perspective." The following morning, in the corner booth of our favorite cafe, I told Margaret everything. The will, Ruth's description of me, what I'd observed. Margaret listened carefully, her lined face thoughtful. "You've always been generous with your money, Rosana," she said finally. "Perhaps too generous." "What do you mean?" "You've solved every problem in that girl's life with your checkbook. College tuition, house down payment, business funding. You've never let her struggle the way you did." "Because I love her," I protested. "Because I could provide what I never had." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I know, dear. But sometimes when we try to protect people from hardship, we accidentally send the message that we don't think they're capable of handling it themselves." Her words stung with possible truth. "And this Eric?" Margaret continued, her voice lowering. "Something about him has always seemed off to me. The way he talks about Ruth's gallery as if he's the business partner rather than the husband." "You think he's using her? Using me?" Margaret's silence was answer enough. That afternoon, I made one final call to Diane, my former daughter-in-law, and Ruth's mother. Despite the divorce, we'd maintained a cordial relationship. "Rosana," she sounded surprised. "Is everything okay?" "I'm trying to understand something about Ruth," I said. "Has she ever mentioned feeling pressured by my financial help?" Diane was quiet for a long moment. "She hasn't said it directly to me, but Eric has mentioned it several times." "Eric talks to you about this?" "He makes comments about how Ruth feels she can never live up to your expectations because you've given her so much. About how she feels trapped by your generosity." My chest tightened. "Those were his words or hers?" "His," Diane admitted. But Ruth never contradicted him. After hanging up, I sat in my sunroom watching birds at the feeder, their simple movements a contrast to the complexity of human relationships. The pieces were forming a picture, but it wasn't complete. Sunday dinner was less than 48 hours away, and I was beginning to suspect that the grandchild I thought I knew better than anyone had been living under influences I'd failed to recognize. Sunday arrived with a crisp autumn chill. I spent the morning moving restlessly through my house, rehearsing and discarding different approaches for the conversation ahead. My dining room had hosted countless family dinners over the decades, birthdays, holidays, celebrations, but none had felt as consequential as tonight's. I prepared Ruth's favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary potatoes and the apple pie recipe my mother had passed down to me. The familiar rhythms of cooking steadied my hands, even as my heart raced with anticipation. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Gran. Ruth embraced me, her familiar floral perfume enveloping me. She looked tired, dark circles beneath her eyes poorly concealed with makeup. Eric stood behind her, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Rosana, lovely to see you." I welcomed them in, accepting the bottle of wine Eric handed me with practiced grace. As they settled in the living room, I observed them more carefully than ever before. The way Ruth leaned slightly away from Eric, the way his hand possessively rested on her knee, the tension in her shoulders when he spoke over her. How had I missed these signs before? "The gallery's autumn exhibition is coming together beautifully," Ruth was saying. "We've got 3 new artists featuring their work." "That's wonderful," I replied, setting out appetizers. "The last exhibition was such a success." Eric cleared his throat. "It was, though the profit margins were slimmer than we'd hoped." I noted silently. Not Ruth hoped, but we hoped. "Actually," Ruth said, her voice brightening, "we just sold the Hannigan Sculpture Series. That's a significant commission." Eric patted her hand in a gesture that somehow seemed diminishing rather than supportive. "Which we'll need for the mortgage adjustment next month." Ruth's smile faltered. "Eric, let's not talk business tonight." "It's hardly a secret," he replied, "especially not from Rosana. given how involved she is in our finances. The slight edge in his voice was unmistakable. I met his gaze steadily, refusing to be baited. "Dinner's ready?" I announced, leading them to the dining room where candles flickered against the darkening evening. Through the first course, we maintained light conversation. Community events, James's recent promotion, Margaret's hip replacement. But I could feel the unspoken tension building, like pressure before a storm. Finally, as I served the main course, I decided it was time. "Ruth," I said gently, "I need to ask you something important." She looked up, fork paused midway to her mouth. "Of course, Gran. Do you think I'm materialistic?" The question hung in the air. Ruth's face paled, her fork clattering against her plate. "What?" she whispered. "I saw the statement you prepared for my will documentation," I said, keeping my voice measured. "You described me as having materialistic values that have defined my life and relationships." Eric's expression shifted minutely. Surprise. Then something like satisfaction. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "Gran, I just want to understand," I continued. "After everything we've shared, is that truly how you see me?" Ruth looked stricken, glancing between Eric and me. I wasn't saying—" "What Ruthie means," Eric interrupted smoothly, "is that there's been some context lost. We were discussing the impact of financial dynamics on family relationships. It was theoretical, really." "Then why was it in a formal document about my will?" I asked, looking directly at him now. He shifted uncomfortably. "Legal documents often require perspectives on family values. It wasn't meant to be personal." "It felt very personal," I replied, "especially coming from the granddaughter I've always been closest to." Ruth's tears spilled over. "Gran, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it the way it sounds." "Then how did you mean it?" She twisted her napkin in her lap. "It's just, sometimes I feel like you think money solves everything, that if you write a check, problems disappear." "When have I ever given you that impression?" I asked, genuinely bewildered. "Every time I struggle with something." Her voice rose slightly. "College was hard. You paid for a tutor. First apartment had issues. You moved me to a better one. Gallery was struggling. You invested more money. I felt as if I'd been slapped. I was trying to help you." "I know," she said miserably. "But sometimes I needed to figure things out myself. To know I could do it without being rescued." Eric nodded supportively. "What Ruth is trying to say is that your love often comes with financial strings attached." "That's not true," I said firmly. "Isn't it?" he challenged. "The gallery expansion, you insisted on being a signing partner on the account. Ruth's house, you selected the neighborhood. Even our wedding, you upgraded everything we chose." I looked at Ruth, whose gaze was fixed on her plate. "Is that how you feel? That my help comes with strings? Sometimes?" she whispered. "Not always, but sometimes." My chest tightened. "I never meant to control you. I only wanted to make your life easier." "I know, Gran." Ruth reached across the table for my hand. "But sometimes when you step in and fix everything with money, it makes me feel inadequate, like you don't think I can handle things myself." The words echoed Margaret's assessment so closely that I felt a sharp pang of recognition. Had I really been so blind to how my help was perceived? Eric's phone buzzed. He checked it, then stood abruptly. "I need to take this. Work emergency." As he stepped into the hallway, Ruth visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping, her breathing less constricted. And in that moment, watching my granddaughter transform in her husband's absence, I understood that there was much more to this situation than a single comment in a legal document. "Ruth," I said softly, "what's really going on? And please be honest with me." With Eric out of the room, The dining room seemed to exhale. Ruth's gaze darted nervously toward the hallway where we could hear Eric's muffled voice. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "Gran," she whispered, "I never meant to hurt you. You have to believe that." I covered her hand with mine, noting how cold her fingers felt despite the warmth of the room. "Then help me understand what's happening, sweetheart." She drew a shaky breath. "Eric thinks—" She stopped, glancing again toward the hallway. "Eric says you use your money to control me, that you've always seen me as an investment rather than a person. And do you believe that?" Her hesitation was answer enough. "Ruth, I've only ever wanted to support you," I said gently. "If I've made you feel controlled or diminished, that was never my intention." Tears pooled in her eyes. "I know. But Eric says—" "I'm more interested in what you think," I interrupted softly. "Not what Eric says you should think." She bit her lip. "Things have been difficult lately." "The gallery?" "No, the gallery's doing well. It's—" She lowered her voice even further. "It's our finances. Eric made some investments that didn't work out. We're struggling, but he won't let me tell anyone." The pieces clicked further into place. "Is that where the money from the joint account has been going? The withdrawals to Sanders' architectural heritage?" She looked startled. "How did you—" "I still receive statements, Ruth. I've seen the transfers." She closed her eyes briefly. "It was supposed to be temporary, just until his business took off. But then there were more investments and more losses and—" She cut herself off, her eyes darting toward the hallway again. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Ruth, are you afraid of Eric?" "No," she answered too quickly. "No, he just gets frustrated when things don't go as planned. He works so hard." "And the comment about me being materialistic? Was that his idea or yours?" She flushed. "He helped draft the statement. He said it would be good to establish clear expectations about family values in relation to the inheritance." "Did you read what he wrote before you sent it?" I glanced at it, she admitted. "But things have been so hectic, and Eric said it was just standard legal language." My heart sank. "Oh, Ruth. I'm sorry, Gran," she whispered. "I should have read it more carefully." Eric's voice grew louder as he approached the dining room. Ruth straightened, her expression shifting into something more guarded. It was a transformation I recognized from my own past, the carefully neutral face I'd worn around my first husband during the bad years before I found the courage to leave. Eric returned, sliding smoothly back into his chair. "Sorry about that. Client emergency." He smiled at me, all charm. "Now, where were we?" "We were discussing perspectives," I said evenly. "Actually, I was about to show Ruth something important." I excused myself and went to my study, returning with a folder containing the paperwork Richard had shown me. I placed it on the table and opened it to reveal not just the statement about me being materialistic, but the complete document, all 15 pages of it. "I think you should read the entire thing, Ruth, not just the excerpts Eric may have shown." "You?" Eric's expression hardened. "Rosana, this isn't the time or place." "I disagree," I replied firmly. "This is exactly the time and place." Ruth looked between us, then slowly pulled the document closer. As she read, her expression changed, from confusion to shock. "I didn't write this," she said finally, looking up with wide eyes. "I mean, some of it sounds like me, but most of it, these conditions and restrictions, I never said any of this." Eric shifted uncomfortably. "It's just legal jargon, Ruthie. All wills have that kind of language." "No," I said quietly. "They don't? Not unless someone wants to control how the inheritance is used." Ruth continued reading, her face growing paler with each page. "This says I believe Gran should place restrictions on any inheritance to family members with proven financial irresponsibility." She looked up at Eric. What does that mean? It's just protective language, he insisted, to ensure the family legacy is preserved. And this part, Ruth continued, her voice strengthening, about how inheritance should be managed by a third-party financial advisor, specifically Sanders Financial Planning. She stared at him. That's your cousin's company. Eric's jaw tightened. Ryan is highly qualified. The same Ryan who advised you on those failed investments? Ruth challenged, her voice rising slightly. She turned to me, her eyes clearing. Gran, I never wrote these things. I would never try to control your decisions about your own money. I reached across the table and turned to the final page of the document. Did you sign this, Ruth? She examined the signature at the bottom, running her finger over it. This looks like my signature, but I don't remember signing this specific document. Her brow furrowed. I signed some paperwork Eric brought home a few months ago. He said it was for the gallery's tax filings. Eric stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous. Ruthie, we should go. But Ruth didn't move. Instead, she continued reading, flipping back through the pages with growing agitation. There's a whole section here about how Gran should reconsider her wasteful charitable giving and focus on family financial security instead. She looked up at me, horror dawning on her face. Gran, I know how much your charitable foundation means to you. I would never call it wasteful. Eric placed his hands on the back of his chair, knuckles white. Ruth, this isn't the time. When is the time, Eric? She challenged, a strength in her voice I hadn't heard all evening. When were you going to tell me you used my signature on a document I never read? When were you going to mention you've been trying to manipulate my grandmother's will to benefit yourself? The tension in the room was palpable. Eric's expression shifted from charm to anger to calculation so quickly it was almost imperceptible. But I recognized it. I'd seen it before in people who valued money over relationships. You're overreacting, he said, his voice deceptively calm. This is a simple misunderstanding. Is it? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been manipulating both of us, using Ruth's trust in you to try to control my estate planning. Eric's face hardened. I think we're done here. Ruth, get your coat. But Ruth didn't move. She looked at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. No, she said quietly. I'm not done. And in that moment, with her chin lifted and her gaze steady, she looked so much like me in my younger years that my heart swelled with a mixture of pride and worry. I understood now that the wound I'd discovered in Richard's office went much deeper than a single hurtful comment. What I had stumbled upon wasn't just Ruth's opinion of me. It was evidence of Eric's attempt to drive a wedge between us, to position himself advantageously for financial gain, and the most important revelation wasn't in the legal documents at all. It was in Ruth's eyes as she met my gaze across the table, a look that silently asked for help while finding the courage to stand her ground. Eric's face contorted with barely contained fury. Ruth, I said we're leaving. Now. No. The single word hung in the air between them, simple but powerful. I watched my granddaughter's transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. This wasn't the compliant Ruth who had entered my home hours earlier. This was a woman reclaiming her voice. What did you say? Eric's tone dropped dangerously. I'm staying with Gran tonight. Ruth's voice was steady despite her trembling hands. We have a lot to talk about. Eric looked from Ruth to me, calculation evident in his eyes. This is ridiculous. You're overreacting to standard legal language. Is it standard to forge signatures? I asked quietly. I didn't forge anything, he snapped. Ruth signed it. Under false pretenses, Ruth countered. You told me it was gallery. Paperwork. Eric's charm mask slipped completely. After everything I've done for you, for that failing gallery of yours, this is how you repay me? My gallery isn't failing, Ruth said. It's the one part of our finances that's actually stable. I watched the realization dawn on her face as she spoke the words aloud. The gallery was never the problem, was it? Ruth continued, her voice strengthening. It's your investments, your debts that we've been covering with Grand's money. The silence that followed was damning. I think you should leave, Eric, I said firmly. Ruth will call you tomorrow. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Then, with deliberate slowness, he straightened his jacket and moved toward the door. This conversation isn't over, Ruthie. No, she agreed. It isn't. When the front door closed behind him, Ruth collapsed into her chair, her composure crumbling as tears streamed down her face. I moved to sit beside her, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. I'm so sorry, Gran, she whispered between sobs. I had no idea what he was doing. Shh, I soothed. You have nothing to be sorry for. But I should have known. I should have questioned why he suddenly became so interested in your estate planning. I handed her a tissue. Manipulative people are very good at what they do, sweetheart. Believe me, I know. She looked up, surprised. You do? Did I ever tell you about my first husband? Before I met your grandfather? She shook her head. I was 22, working as a secretary at a law firm. He was charming, attentive, and very interested in the modest inheritance my parents had. Left me. I smiled wryly at the memory. By the time I realized what was happening, he'd convinced me to invest in several of his business opportunities. All failures, of course. What did you do? Ruth asked, wiping her eyes. I left him. Started over with nothing but determination and the promise that I'd never let anyone control me through money again. I squeezed her hand. Which is why I've always wanted financial security for you, so you'd never be trapped the way I was. Understanding dawned in her eyes. I never knew. We don't always share our hardest lessons, even with those we love most. I sighed. I thought I was protecting you by making sure you never struggled financially. Instead, I may have left you vulnerable in other ways. Ruth leaned her head against my shoulder, a gesture so reminiscent of her childhood that my heart ached. I don't think you're materialistic, Gran. I never did. But there was truth in what you said earlier, I acknowledged. I have tried to solve problems with money. Maybe too often. We sat in silence for a moment, the emotional weight of the evening settling around us. What do I do now? She finally asked, her voice small. That's for you to decide, I said gently. But whatever you choose, I'm here to support you. Not just financially, but in all the ways that matter. I don't think I can go home tonight, she whispered. Then stay here. Your old room is always ready for you. She nodded gratefully. Can we talk? Really talk? About everything? I'd like that, I said, rising to clear the barely touched dinner plates. Let me make us some tea. In the kitchen, as I filled the kettle, I found myself reflecting on the irony of the situation. For years, I'd believed that providing financial security was the greatest gift I could give my family. Now I realize that the most valuable inheritance might be something else entirely: the courage to stand up for oneself, the wisdom to recognize manipulation, the strength to begin again when necessary. Later, seated in the living room with steaming mugs of chamomile tea, Ruth and I began a conversation that should have happened years ago. Not about money or wills or investments, but about our hopes, our fears, our mistakes, and what we had learned from them. I was so afraid of disappointing you, Ruth admitted. You've accomplished so much, built a company from nothing. I felt I could never measure up. And I was so determined you wouldn't struggle the way I did that I never let you find your own strength, I replied. Perhaps we both need to forgive ourselves a little. We talked late into the night, peeling back layers of misunderstanding that had accumulated over the years. With each honest exchange, I felt the distance between us shrinking, replaced by a deeper understanding than we'd ever shared before. When Ruth finally yawned, exhaustion overtaking her, I walked her to her childhood bedroom. The room still held remnants of her adolescence, debate trophies, art school acceptance letter framed. On the wall, the quilt I'd made for her 16th birthday. "I've kept it exactly the same," I said, a little embarrassed by the sentimentality. Ruth smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. "It's perfect." She hesitated, then hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Gran. Not just for tonight, but for everything. We'll figure this out together," I promised. One step at a time. After she closed her door, I returned to the dining room and gathered the legal papers spread across the table. Eric's manipulation had nearly succeeded in driving a wedge between Ruth and me, a reminder that the greatest threats often come disguised as concern. Tomorrow there would be practical matters to address, consulting with Richard about the forged documents, helping Ruth evaluate her financial entanglement with Eric, considering what legal steps might be necessary. But tonight had given me something infinitely more valuable: the restoration of trust with my granddaughter, and the recognition that my true legacy would never be measured in dollars and cents. 6. Months can change everything. Spring had arrived in full force, coaxing blossoms from reluctant branches and warming the earth after winter's chill. I sat on my porch swing, watching Ruth arrange potted geraniums along the steps, a Saturday ritual we had established in the month since that fateful dinner. "These will look beautiful once they fill in," she said, brushing soil from her hands. "Just like last year," I agreed, pouring her a glass of lemonade from the pitcher beside me. She joined me on the swing, our shoulders touching comfortably as we rocked gently. The easy silence between us was still new enough to feel precious, a hard-won peace after the turbulence that had followed Eric's departure from our lives. The divorce proceedings had been mercifully swift, accelerated by the evidence Richard had compiled about Eric's financial manipulations. The forged documents had been just the beginning. A deeper investigation revealed a pattern of deception extending back to the early days of Ruth's marriage. I got the final gallery numbers yesterday, Ruth said, breaking the silence. "We're up 38% from last year." "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely proud. "The new location is really thriving." The gallery's expansion had been Ruth's own achievement, funded not by my checkbook this time, but through a small business loan she had secured independently. I had offered to help, of course, but she had gently declined. "I need to do this myself, Gran," she had explained. "Not because I don't appreciate your generosity, but because I need to know that I can." It had been difficult for me to step back, to resist the impulse to solve problems that weren't mine to solve. But I was learning, just as Ruth was learning to stand confidently on her own foundation. "James called this morning," I said. "He's bringing Anna to dinner tomorrow?" Ruth smiled. "Dad seems happy with her." "He does," I agreed. James's new relationship was progressing well, another positive change in our reshaping family landscape. Ruth took a sip of lemonade, her expression growing more serious. "I've been thinking about something." "Oh, remember when we talked about starting a mentorship program at the community center? For young artists who can't afford formal education?" I nodded. It had been a passing conversation months ago, one of many ideas we had discussed during our weekend visits. "I've worked out a plan," she continued, a quiet excitement in her voice. "It wouldn't take much to get started. Just space and some basic supplies. The artists from the gallery have already volunteered to teach workshops." I felt a familiar impulse rise within me, the urge to immediately offer financial backing to smooth the path forward with my resources. But I caught myself, remembering the lessons of the past 6 months. "That sounds wonderful," I said instead. "Tell me more about your plan." Ruth outlined her vision with growing animation, a program that would provide not just art education but business skills, helping young people from disadvantaged backgrounds build sustainable creative careers. Her eyes shone with purpose, her hands sketching imaginary spaces in the air as she spoke. When she finished, she looked at me expectantly. "What do you think?" "I think it's brilliant," I said honestly. "You've thought of everything." She hesitated. "There is one thing I wanted to ask you about." "Financial support?" I guessed, careful to keep my tone neutral. She shook her head, surprising me. "No, I've already secured a small grant from the City Arts Council, and I'm contributing some of the gallery profits." She took a deep breath. "What I'd like is your involvement. Your experience, your business knowledge. Would you consider being an advisor for the program? Not as my wealthy grandmother, but as the woman who built a company from nothing." I felt tears prick behind my eyes. This request, for my knowledge, my experience, my time rather than my money, meant more than any expression of gratitude ever could. "I would be honored," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Ruth squeezed my hand. "Thank you." We rocked in comfortable silence, watching as neighborhood children rode bicycles up and down the street, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Later that afternoon, as Ruth prepared to leave, I remembered something. "Wait here a moment," I said, going to my study. I returned with a slim leather portfolio, worn soft with age and use. "What's this?" Ruth asked as I handed it to her. "Open it," I prompted gently. Inside was the original business plan for Miller. Manufacturing, handwritten on now yellowed pages, full of crossed-out calculations and margin notes. The humble beginnings of what would eventually become a multi-million-dollar company. "I was 28 when I wrote this," I explained as Ruth carefully turned the fragile pages. "A divorced single mother with no college education and very little money." Everyone said I was being foolish, chasing an impossible dream. Ruth looked up, her eyes wide. "I never knew it started like this. You always made it sound so inevitable." I laughed softly. "Nothing worthwhile is ever inevitable, sweetheart. It's built one difficult decision at a time, often with no guarantee of success." She nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Like the mentorship program." "Like many things in life," I agreed. "I want you to have this. Not as an heirloom to put away somewhere, but as a reminder that the most valuable inheritance I can give you isn't monetary. Your courage," Ruth said softly, "your resilience. And the knowledge that you have those same qualities within you," I added. "They've always been there, whether I could see them or not." Ruth held the portfolio carefully, as if it contained something far more precious than old paper and faded ink. In a way, it did. A legacy of determination that no legal document could ever fully capture. "I've been thinking about my will," I said casually as we walked to her car. She glanced at me sharply. "Gran, you don't need to—" "It's not what you think," I interrupted with a smile. "Richard and I have been discussing some changes. Less focus on financial distributions, more on creating a structure that honors what each family member truly needs." I paused. "And values." Ruth nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind my words. "That sounds perfect." As I watched her drive away, portfolio safely tucked beside her, I felt a profound sense of peace. The painful revelation of 6 months ago, discovering that cruel description in my will, had led to something I never could have anticipated: a deeper, more authentic relationship with my granddaughter. The materialistic grandmother comment that had once wounded me so deeply now seemed like a gift in disguise. The catalyst that had forced both Ruth and me to confront uncomfortable truths and find our way to genuine understanding. Later that evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I reflected on the true nature of legacy. It wasn't the houses or investments or treasured possessions that would define what I left behind. It was these moments of connection, the hard conversations we'd finally had the courage to have, the trust rebuilt on stronger foundations, The knowledge that Ruth would move forward in her life not weighed down by obligation or resentment, but empowered by understanding and love. Some inheritances, I had learned, were far too valuable to be listed in any will.